Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Frances Stewart. I am the co-chair of the Education Committee for Elders Climate Action. Some of you may be new to Elders Climate Action and wonder, who we are. Basically, we are the elders, including grandparents, great aunts, and great uncles, and other folks who care about the future for all children. As ECA members, we are determined to do all we can to leave a livable planet for future generations. Our programs, communications, and chapters seek to inform, inspire, and engage others across generations to take action on the climate crisis on the local, state, and national levels. ECA is elder-centered and volunteer-driven, and you can learn more about us or get more involved at eldersclimateaction.org. Now, about this call, we're going to be together for an hour this evening. We're going to have a presentation by our guest speaker. It's going to be followed by a Q&A. So please put your questions in the Q&A box. Please do it in the Q&A box other than the chat. We don't want to lose track of any of your questions, but they're all in one place. It will make it so much easier. And we are very happy tonight to have Scott Faber as our guest speaker. Scott leads the Environmental Working Group's government affairs efforts. He's worked on the Farm Bill for almost 30 years. He has frequently testified before Congress on food, farm, energy, water, and chemical policy issues. He is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Law Center. He's also one of EWG's top spokespeople and a frequent source for journalists with national and regional media outlets. He's appeared on network and cable news programs and in documentary films. He's regularly quoted in the Washington Post, the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, the Associated Press, Politico, and CNN.com, among many others. So, Scott, please take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Frances. And thanks to Elders Climate Action for everything you do. As someone who spends a lot of time talking to members of Congress and their staff and folks who work for the agencies that you're all familiar with, the EPA, the FDA, I can tell you that your voices matter much more than the folks like me who are here every day. So thank you for raising your voices on behalf of our planet. I'm going to share my screen and talk about the Farm Bill. Here we go. And I hope that everybody can see that. Yes, terrific. Well, let's talk a little bit about, the Farm Bill. If you remember nothing else about what I say tonight, it's that the Farm Bill is probably our best opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in this Congress. It's legislation that Congress must pass by the end of this year. We have to renew the Farm Bill once every 5 years. It's set to expire actually on September 30th. Congress will miss that deadline, but will almost certainly finish its work on the Farm Bill by the end of this year. And it is really the one big opportunity to help reduce emissions, especially greenhouse gas emissions from our farmers. And as many of you know, because you're so active on climate issues, we simply can't meet our goals for the climate unless we do more to reduce emissions from agriculture. And we'll talk more about U.S. emissions and agriculture's share of U.S. emissions. But again, really grateful for your interest in the Farm Bill and anything you can do to help make climate a priority for the Farm Bill that Congress is about to finish work on. So let's just start by talking a little bit about agriculture's impact on the climate. And as this chart shows you, the little orange wedge there on the left, agriculture accounts for at least 11% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. And I say at least because that does not include the emissions associated with producing fertilizer. It does not include the emissions associated with clearing land to grow crops. Those are just the emissions associated with applying fertilizer, running farm equipment, and from farm animals and their wastes. And when we take a closer look at that 11% part of the pie chart, some of you will be surprised to learn that the majority of those emissions, the majority of agriculture's emissions, are not carbon dioxide emissions that we typically worry about when we worry about climate change. The majority of those emissions are actually nitrous oxide emissions, and those are emissions that are caused when we use chemical fertilizers to fertilize crops, primarily corn. So more than half of the emissions from agriculture are nitrous oxide emissions that come from applying fertilizer, which then converts into nitrous oxide. And as some of you may know, nitrous oxide is 300 times more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. The other big share of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture is methane emissions, the red part of the pie chart on your right. And as of course, methane emissions come from animals, from both ends of the animals, but methane emissions also are emitted by the waste left behind from animals, animal manure. And so when you put the whole picture together, more than 95% of emissions from agriculture are either nitrous oxide emissions or methane emissions, not the carbon dioxide emissions that we typically worry about when we worry about climate change. And unlike every other sector of the economy, this time period, I don't know if you can see it behind me and Leslie and Francis and Jen, the time period for this is the last 20 years or so. Unlike every other sector of the economy, emissions from agriculture are actually going up. Every other sector of the economy over the last 20 years, in particular, the electric power sector, has seen their emissions go down, in some cases pretty significantly, but only one sector of the economy has seen its emissions go up in the last 20 years, and that's agriculture. And if we stay on the path we're on, if as a result of the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which I'm sure you've talked about in previous calls, as a result of other policies that states have adopted, if we stay on the course we're on and emissions from energy and transportation fall as much as expected, agriculture will actually account for more than 30% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So let me say that again, because I know that'll surprise some of you. Right now, agriculture accounts for at least 11% of US greenhouse gas emissions. But unlike energy emissions, which are dropping significantly, are expected to drop significantly, or transportation emissions, which are also expected to drop significantly as we see the widespread adoption of electric vehicles, agriculture emissions are expected to stay more or less the same. And that means that agriculture's share of emissions will increase. Again, this is all according to the model. The same models we use to predict the benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act increased from 11%, as you saw in that first pie chart, to 32% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2015, and be the number one source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States by 2050. And of course, that's not just a catastrophe for the planet, it's also a political catastrophe for our farmers, because no one, least of all our farmers, want to be the number one source of greenhouse gas emissions. And oftentimes when I talk to my colleagues who are farmers or work for farm organizations, they are very worried about this pie chart in particular, because it does mean there'll be more and more pressure growing on farmers to reduce their emissions, and some of that might come in the form of new regulations. But if farmers were incented to adopt common sense, already widely understood, widely available practices like planting cover crops, or changing how they till their fields, or rotating their crops, or planting buffers of grass in their fields or on the edge of their fields, very basic practices, this picture could be very different. Some analysis that was done by the Boston Consulting Group, or BCG, found that the widespread adoption of very basic conservation practices, including, again, cover crops, better tillage practices, rotating crops, installing buffers of grasses and trees within fields or on the edges of fields, changing what we feed animals to reduce some of the methane that comes from animals, changing how we manage animal waste. In combination, these practices could significantly change agriculture's contribution from going from 11% to 32% to going from 11% to just 21%, again, according to BCG. And while that's still not a great picture, it's a much better picture if you're worried about the future of the planet, or if you work for a farm organization, or yourself you're a farmer and you're worried about the political future for agriculture. In fact, we just did some analysis, it's on our website, where we looked at the widespread adoption of 6 practices just in the Corn Belt to figure out if farmers in those Corn Belt states adopted basic practice, what would the result be? And we found, and I'll just read it to you: rotating crops, adopting cover crops, changing tillage practices, and targeted planting of strips of grasses and trees could reduce Corn Belt nitrous oxide emissions by more than 4 million metric tons if implemented. Such a shift would provide the same climate benefit as taking almost 1 million gasoline-powered cars off the road. And again, these are all practices that many farmers, if not most farmers, are already adopting. But not all of them, not enough of them to change the picture that we've described for you so far. So let's just take a minute to talk about the Farm Bill, the big picture of the Farm Bill. More than 80% of the funding in the Farm Bill actually doesn't go to farmers. It probably should be called the Food Bill, not the Farm Bill, because more than 80% of the spending that will be allocated in this next Farm Bill, which, by the way, is $1.4 trillion of spending, a lot of money. More than 80% of that goes out as anti-hunger assistance through the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or what used to be called the Food Stamp Program. And I think everyone on this call can agree that we absolutely should do more to help make sure that no one goes hungry, and that we need to invest in programs like SNAP. And we shouldn't make it harder for people to participate in programs like SNAP. But what I really wanted to show you from this slide is just where the other money goes, the other 20% of the money goes. And as you see from this slide, the orange and blue parts of the slide are two different kinds of farm subsidies. The purple and the gray parts of the slide are funding for USDA conservation programs. And these are programs that pay farmers to adopt many of the practices that I just talked about, whether that's planting cover crops, adopting better tillage practices, rotating their crops, planting buffers of trees and grasses along their fields or within their fields. We do provide, until the adoption of the Inflation Reduction Act, we've been providing about $6 billion a year to farmers to adopt these basic common sense practices. Sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money, but there's so much farmer demand for these programs. So many farmers want to do their part to help the environment that until the adoption of the Inflation Reduction Act, 2 out of 3 farmers were still being turned away when they asked to help share the cost of, in particular, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So think about that for a minute. So we have all these farmers coming to USDA to say, I want to be a good climate steward. I want to be part of addressing the climate crisis. I'm seeing firsthand, because I'm a farmer, the effects of extreme weather. I know that climate change is happening, and I want to help do my part. I want to help reduce emissions. And by doing so, I want to make my farm more resilient. I want to make my farm better able to withstand the extreme weather that I'm already experiencing as a result of climate change. And 2 out of 3 of those farmers were being told, sorry, we don't have any money for you. So one of the big breakthroughs was including $20 billion over 4 years in the Inflation Reduction Act, specifically and exclusively for farmers to adopt these sorts of climate smart practices like cover crops and better tillage practices, better management of fertilizer, all the practices that might help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, especially nitrous oxide and methane emissions. And so I wanted to help you understand sort of just how important that IRA funding is to helping address the climate crisis. Until the IRA was enacted, most conservation funding was not actually going to practices that reduce emissions. So as crazy as that sounds, most of the $6 billion a year that we were giving to farmers to address the environment were actually not going to practices that help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We did some analysis. We have a database called you can find it yourself, conservation.ewg.org. We did some analysis that discovered that only 23% of funding for our biggest conservation program called the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, only 23% of that funding was going to practices that reduce emissions. The lion's share of that funding, 72%, was going to practices that did nothing to reduce emissions. And oftentimes were things like irrigation pipelines and aquaculture ponds and things that would make sense if you were a farmer because they were a cost of doing business, but might not make sense if you're a taxpayer who's worried about the climate crisis. A small percentage of the funding, about 5%, we found was going to practices, according to USDA, that were actually increasing greenhouse gas emissions, if you can imagine that. So we were literally taking money from a program called the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, giving it to farmers to adopt practices on their farms that increase greenhouse gas emissions, such as building animal waste lagoons, these big pits that animal manure is stored in. And so I think we can all agree that doesn't make much sense. The picture is even worse for another big conservation program called the Conservation Stewardship Program. We found that only 5% of CSP money, or Conservation Stewardship Program money, was going to practices that reduce emissions. Likewise, we found that almost all of the acres that were enrolled in the other big conservation program, the Conservation Reserve Program, a program that's really designed to pay farmers to plant grasses and trees in lieu of farming. We found almost all of those acres were being plowed up at the end of their 10-year contracts, just releasing soil carbon back into the atmosphere. So while it's a good thing that farmers were fallowing those lands for 10 years, all of the benefits of fallowing those lands for 10 years and all the soil carbon that built up during those 10 years was simply being lost when those contracts expired. So what should we do to make the climate a priority in this farm bill? Well, first, we absolutely have to protect the climate smart funding in the Inflation Reduction Act. And as I said, until the Inflation Reduction Act passed in the last Congress, 2 out of 3 farmers were being turned away when they offered to help address climate change. And that's thanks to the IRA, and in particular, thanks to Michigan Senator Debbie Stabenow, that's changed for the better. Many more farmers are now being rewarded when they take steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's great news. Unfortunately, there are some members of Congress who are trying to cut the funding that was the climate smart funding that was provided in the IRA. So it's in order to increase farm subsidies. So it's very, very important that we protect the climate smart funding in the IRA. If you're talking to members of Congress or their staff, that would be the first, second, and third thing I'd say. Whatever you do, protect the climate smart funding and the Inflation Reduction Act, and they'll all nod because they've heard a lot from folks like you. The second thing we need to do is we really need to make climate change a bigger priority for our conservation programs, and we need to make a culture change within USDA so that the farmers who are coming to the front door, who are coming to their county office to say, I want to be a climate steward, I want to be a climate smart farmer, I want to share the cost of practices that reduce nitrous oxide or methane emissions. Those farmers are the first farmers who we give funding to. We need to treat the climate crisis like a real priority, and we've not done that at USDA. And we certainly should change the law to make it clear that no funds should ever go to practices that increase greenhouse gas emissions. And there have been some bills that would try to accomplish that. And then the last thing we should do, and then I'll stop there, and I'd love to answer any of your questions or take your comments and feedback, is we need to reform the Conservation Reserve Program, or the other big conservation program that we have been funding for many years, to fallow land, to get longer term deals, to create carbon sinks so that farmers who are farming land that's hard to farm, marginal land, they're probably losing money on anyways. Let's put those lands in a long-term easement so that we're building soil carbon over the long haul. And so let me stop there, and love to answer your questions.
Thanks, Scott. Got question about the expected relative contribution of agriculture to greenhouse gas emissions. You've said that that's going to be increasing. Does that expectation take into account the necessary changes to agriculture in the face of ongoing climate change and extreme weather events? And does it assume that there's going to be no change in agricultural practices, or does it adjust for that?
Thank you, Wendy. That's a great question. I'm happy to point you to the analysis that the Boston Consulting Group did on this question. They did assume that more farmers would adopt basic conservation practices, but that very few would. That it would be status quo plus, not status quo plus plus plus. And so I think that it does seem likely that more and more farmers, as they suffer from more and more extreme weather, will decide to adopt practices like cover crops that make their farms more resilient, that make their farms better able to withstand the extreme weather caused by climate change. But agriculture is a unique beneficiary of many different kinds of protection from especially weather-related risks. We provide a really generous farm safety net that includes, among other things, subsidized crop insurance. So the vast majority of large commercial farms now have crop insurance, which is subsidized on average about 40% by the U.S. government, by the taxpayers. That obviously provides a disincentive for farmers to make their farms climate ready, if you will. It doesn't, also the things that you would do to make your farm more resilient, make your farm better able to withstand climate change, are not necessarily the same things that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions, especially nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer use or methane emissions from animals in their waste. So while many of those things are certainly changing tillage practices and planting cover crops, the climate benefits of those practices, the greenhouse gas benefits of those practices are more speculative. They're harder to measure. We're still learning a lot about how those practices help build soil carbon. But again, there's no doubt that they'll make your farm better able to withstand the extreme weather caused by climate change.
Another question related to that, are there any incentives in the Farm Bill, so, as we're expecting it to be so far, for regenerative farming? And if there are, how do we advocate for them? Or if they're not, how do we advocate that they be added?
Yes. So there are already many, there are essentially 4 big programs that we fund through the Farm Bill, that we reauthorize through the Farm Bill. I've mentioned 3 of them. One, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, that pays farmers anywhere from 75 to 100% of the cost of many of the practices that I've described. A lot of farmers are using EQIP to pay for the cost of installing cover crops, for example. A little bit more complicated program is the Conservation Stewardship Program. Also pays farmers to change the way they farm, but requires farmers to address the environmental challenges on their farms more holistically. I mentioned the Conservation Reserve Program, which generally pays farmers to retire land for 10 to 15 years and plant grasses and trees. And then finally, there's a newer program called the Regional Conservation Cooperative Partnership Program, or RCPP. That program pays groups of farmers to come together to try to address environmental challenges. And there's some evidence that suggests when groups of farmers work together to try to address these challenges, they're more durable, as you would expect. So all of those programs are important to helping farmers reduce emissions. Farmers all use them in different ways. So it's really important that they are funded so that we're not turning away farmers. If we cut funding, the funding that was provided in the Inflation Reduction Act, which exclusively goes to climate smart practices, if we cut funding for other conservation programs, there'll simply be many more farmers being turned away. And I should say, probably goes without saying, but just in case, many of these practices either cost money to install cover crops, or they require farmers to expend more time and labor, or they require farmers to take new risks. So farmers can get paid to change how they're using fertilizer to ultimately reduce the nitrous oxide emissions caused by fertilizer. But using less fertilizer, or changing the kind of fertilizer you're using, changing the timing of the fertilizer you're using, can impact your yields. Any of you are gardeners or farmers yourselves know that that when you apply the fertilizer, the kind of fertilizer you apply, how you apply it can have a big impact on your yield. That's true whether you're growing tomatoes in your backyard or whether you're growing corn in the middle of Indiana. So when we ask farmers to change how they're using fertilizer to take new risks, we as taxpayers ought to be prepared to help underwrite some of those risks. And then I think the last thing I'll just mention is that there is more and more private sector funding going to farmers to reduce emissions. Some of it is helpful. Some of it is probably greenwashing. Some of you are probably familiar with this. When you get on an airplane or go to a hotel and you're asked to offset your travel costs, sometimes those offsets pay, or you hope, pay farmers to change the way they farm to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Unfortunately, in most of those cases, there's really no verification of those efforts and a lot of double counting. And so while it's great that there's private sector funding coming in to help farmers implement these practices, it's hard to know how effective they are. It's hard to know how effective they are. There's really no third-party verification that folks are doing what we hope they're doing.
I got a question about vertical farming and other approaches to urban farming. What do you think about that? And will it be addressed in the Farm Bill?
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of reason to be hopeful about vertical farming. Of course, we've been growing food in greenhouses and indoor farming for many years. Vertical farming, sort of taking that to the next level. Most of that so far is for leafy greens and herbs, but there's some really promising developments for other crops. Unfortunately, most of the emissions associated with agriculture are not yet the things we grow on vertical farms. Most of the emissions associated with agriculture are fertilizing animal feed, corn, and the animals themselves, the methane from the animals and their waste. So if you're looking at that pie chart of what are the big sources of greenhouse gas emissions, right now, so far, vertical farming doesn't really provide any solutions. One thing that does provide an impactful, really significantly impactful alternative is occasionally, once in a while, choosing a plant-based option. While most of us are not vegetarians and probably won't become vegetarians, all of us who aren't vegetarians could eat a lot less animal protein. And small changes in our diets can have a really, really significant impact on the overall greenhouse gas impacts associated with food and agriculture. And according to Rhodium and BCG and Stanford and Oxford and a lot of the other experts, may be one of the most impactful things that we can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the food system. So again, not suggesting that everyone needs to change their diets to abandon animal proteins altogether. But instead suggesting that small changes, simply occasionally swapping out an animal protein with a plant-based protein, or dairy milk with a plant-based milk, can have a really significant impact on not just your emissions, your personal footprint, but on the overall emissions from agriculture. And worth noting, helps farmers, right? Farmers produce the ingredients that make up our plant-based foods, helps the rural workers who turn those ingredients oftentimes in the foods we love. So it's also a great way to help support agriculture. So something to think about.
Great. Do you think there'll be any funding for agrivoltaics in the Farm Bill?
That's a great question. There's a lot of interest in vertical farming, agrivoltaics, other kinds of innovative ways to produce food. I want to be careful that I'm getting this right. I'm confident that there are ways agrivoltaics can get funded now through various USDA programs. Whoever it is that asks that question can email me, and I'll do a little research for you. But so I think it's maybe more a question of whether folks are applying for the right grants and loans and other programs at USDA. I think one thing that folks who are associated with Elders Climate Action maybe appreciate more than others is that agriculture and food and agriculture have evolved a lot. and over the years, and how we produce food, how we process food, what we choose to eat, what we choose to give our families has changed dramatically in our lifetimes. And I expect that we'll continue to see a lot of innovation. A lot of the innovation that we've seen in the past has been about making food cheaper, making it taste better. I guess that's in the eye of the beholder, or the mouth of the beholder, to have it last longer, right? To address some of the safety issues associated with food. But I expect in the future, there'll be a lot more innovation that's designed to address these big issues around climate, because it's just going to matter more and more. And consumers are going to be looking for foods that reflect their values, especially their concerns about the climate more and more. One thing that's already happening in Europe, I expect to see coming here soon, is a push to put a carbon disclosure on food, much like a calorie disclosure. So there's a petition pending in the EU right now to require a numerical carbon disclosure on all packaged foods, so that you can look at two beverages or two packaged foods and say, oh, I want to get the one that results in fewer greenhouse gas emissions. And once that becomes more transparent, consumers will be able to really vote with their forks in a way that they haven't, just as they had since the passage of the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act now 32 years ago. Really radically changed how consumers, and not only what consumers chose to eat, but how manufacturers made food, right? So a lot of manufacturers, knowing that the nutrition facts panel was coming, reformulated their foods so that the numbers on the package around calories, salt, sugar, fat didn't look quite as bad. Once a mandatory carbon disclosure is required, and I think inevitably it will be, that will drive a lot of reformulation and changes all the way down these supply chains, especially with how ingredients are produced. When you look at pick your favorite food, it's how the ingredients are raised, how the ingredients in particular are fertilized, that are going to account for the biggest part of the carbon hit.
I noticed when I went to the grocery store over the weekend that some of the foods had a new low carbon tag on them. So that may be a step in that direction, although those things were not processed foods for the most part.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, that's I'd love to know where you saw that. Do you remember where
it was it? My Organic Market in Rockville, Maryland.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, small chain of organic groceries.
Yeah. Well, it's an issue that we're actually very a little concerned about, because there are all sorts of claims being made, like low carbon or climate friendly, that first of all are unverified. So if it's on a USDA regulated product, there's like a meat or dairy product, there's no requirement that the farmer ultimately be subject to some kind of third-party verification. So we don't know if it's true or not. And some of these labels are showing up low carbon, climate friendly on beef. And particular, Tyson's has launched a line of beef called Brazen Beef. And really the only thing brazen about it is the claim. And there's simply, there's no way, and I know this is going to upset some of you, but I'm going to say it anyways. There's no way you can produce beef in a way that doesn't still result in beef being the worst choice for the climate. It's just unfortunately true, especially for folks who love beef. It's always the worst choice for the climate. And reducing the emissions associated with beef by 10%, which is what folks associated with these claims are saying they're doing. If they are, it's still a mystery. It's unverified. Just reducing the emissions still makes beef a dramatically worse choice for the climate than chicken or seafood or lamb, or certainly a plant-based option. I'm glad you mentioned that, Francis.
All of those were actually nuts and beans, at least the ones that I saw.
Those sound like better choices. Yeah.
So, and Robert said that his cousins in Kansas do 2 crops a year, winter wheat followed by soybeans with minimal soil turning. And it seems like they're doing everything they can. He was wondering what you thought about.
Yeah, you should thank your cousins. In general, soybeans are nitrogen fixing crops. They don't actually require additional nitrogen or additional fertilizer. growing soybeans with winter wheat is a great way to grow food that we can all enjoy, that doesn't have the same kind of impact on the climate that growing corn for, especially for primarily for animal feed or ethanol, has. So and then minimal soil turning, I assume means conservation tillage or some version of conservation tillage. And certainly that's a great way to try to keep more of the carbon in the soil and ultimately result in a healthier, stable climate.
Mhm. And I've got a question about a program that pays for carbon sequestration in the soil. And is there any way that those payments, stop when the soil has been saturated with carbon?
Yes, great question. Wow. So this is a really complicated area of science. We're still learning more about how to measure the impacts of practices like cover crops, conservation tillage, and so on soil carbon. It's a lot of these benefits are very site specific. We don't have great data. In fact, USDA just announced within the last month or so, there was a big New York Times story on it, that we needed to spend the next 8 years collecting more data before we could say with a lot of certainty we'd have enough data to really be able to predict the soil carbon benefits of different soil health practices. So while there's lots of good reasons to adopt cover crops and conservation tillage and other soil health practices, and while it's probably the case that our farmers are building soil carbon when they do so, it's really hard to know how much soil carbon is being built. It's really hard to know when we've reached a point of saturation where you're just not. It doesn't make sense to continue to pay the farmer if you've set up an incentive system to do so, except maybe to maintain the practices that the farmer's been adopting. So I hate to say it's complicated, but it's actually very complicated. And by contrast, reducing fertilizer use simply reduces the amount of nitrous oxide going into the atmosphere. It's not simple to calculate, but it's easier to calculate than how much soil carbon is being built by soil health practices. It may soon be the case, or probably will sooner be the case, that we understand the benefits of adding feed additives to the feed we give to farm animals and cows in particular. It will probably soon be the case that we'll be able to really estimate emissions reductions from what's called enteric fermentation, or the methane emissions that come out of both ends of the animal. And so it's probably the case. And again, I think it's important to admit when there isn't certainty. It's probably the case that the practices that reduce nitrous oxide emissions, using less fertilizer first and foremost, but using different fertilizers that are what people would call extended release fertilizers, changing when you use fertilizers or how you apply fertilizers, and then changing what you add to the feed mix, especially feed additives. It's probably the case that those practices will do more sooner to reduce emissions in a way that we can feel confident about than practices that build soil carbon. It doesn't mean there aren't a lot of other good reasons to adopt good soil health practices. First and foremost, to make your farms more resilient, better able to withstand the extreme weather caused by climate. It may be hard to know what the soil carbon benefit is and how to measure that. We'll figure it out. We're on the right path.
Great. So now, climate smart is an interesting term. Is that a term to use with Republicans or other people who are not so open to talking about climate change?
So it was a term that was coined by Congress, and in particular by Senator Stabenow and her team, to help come up. I can't really speak for them, but I think it's a term that USDA and Congress understand. And by that, I mean, now that we've passed the Inflation Reduction Act, and now that USDA has implemented the Inflation Reduction Act, you can go on USDA's website and you can see the list of practices that USDA has identified as climate smart. And so, many of those practices are great practices. There's not a lot of debate about sort of the, except on the margins, about which practices we ought to be funding. It's the ones that I've mentioned: rotating crops, conservation tillage, buffers, cover crops, and changing how you use fertilizer, maybe changing how manure is managed. There's a list of practices that USDA and that most farmers would all agree are climate smart. I think that's helpful because it's provided some direction especially to other folks who might be funding these practices, whether that's state agencies or local governments or big companies who are trying to figure out how do I produce breakfast cereal, or I produce yogurt, or whatever it is I might produce. It helps to provide some direction to me as I'm trying to reduce the emissions associated with my supply chain. So coming up with a kind of a common list of practices, which based on the best science we have, it's always getting better, but the best science we have today, that these are the practices that have the most promise. Agriculture is not like how FDA regulates a drug, where we can really test and know with some precision how effective it is. It's so site specific. There's so much change from farm to farm. It's a little bit harder than prescribing a statin, or and I'm grateful for my statin. I'll just put it out there.
So how open would you say farmers are to making these changes?
I think virtually every farmer is doing something to address the environmental challenges on his or her farm. I think every farmer, just because it's cultural within agriculture, feels an obligation to be a good steward. I think no farmer wants their neighbors to think they're not doing their part to protect their drinking water. I mean, if any of you live in a rural place, like I do, you're relying on a well. You're not, it's not the city or the county that's providing your water. It's really your neighbor that's providing your water, right? Because, whatever my farmer neighbor puts on his or her field might wind up in my well, right? So I think everyone feels a sense of responsibility to help protect the resources around them. I think what's challenging about these issues is we're always learning more about what works, right? And farmers they want to do their part. They also don't want to waste their time doing things that don't work. So learning more about what works is really important. And as I said earlier, it's also really important to recognize that a lot of the practices that reduce the nitrous oxide emissions or the methane emissions that make up 95% of emissions from agriculture, a lot of those practices cost money. They cost money to install. They require farmers to take new risks. They require farmers to use time and energy they wouldn't otherwise use. So even though many farmers would like to do more, these are folks who are running businesses. In some cases, they're not businesses that are necessarily making them a lot of money in any given year. So these are, some are doing great. Most farmers are doing okay. Some farmers are not doing so great. So it's just like any other small business person. When you ask them to do more, it's important to make sure that we're willing to help share those costs.
Another question was, does the Farm Bill cover marketing of various commodities? And if it does, is there a way to use that to encourage people to eat more plant-based foods and less animal-based foods?
Yes. So USDA has done a great job of helping build one of the world's biggest animal protein industries. We are really great at producing animals and animal feed. By far, our biggest exports are animal products and animal feed, mostly to wealthy countries. It's not, as if those of you can remember the "We Feed the World" ADM commercials during Meet David Brinkley, right, back in the day. Well, we don't actually feed the world. We mostly feed animals that are then shipped primarily to Europe and Southeast Asia, or feed grains that if the ones we don't feed to the animals, to Europe or Southeast Asia. And so we've done a great job. And the reason we're so good at that in part is because we've spent a lot of money. And since 1995, we, the taxpayers, have given almost $60 billion to the livestock sector in a wide variety of subsidies. In the same period, we've given about $100 million to the plant-based foods industry. So we have a lot of room to make up. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't support animal proteins. We will. What I am suggesting is that USDA could do a lot more to help stand up and expand the growing plant-based industry. And everyone on this call knows that's where a lot of consumers are headed, especially a lot of younger consumers, in part because they're worried about their personal health, in part because they're worried about animal welfare, in part because they're worried about the greenhouse gas emissions associated with animal proteins. And the good news is, despite the lack of support that's come from USDA, we are #1 in the world. We are the world's plant-based foods leader. That's good. The bad news is lots of other countries want to be the world's plant-based foods leader, and they're outspending us 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times to 1 when it comes to investing in infrastructure and research and other kinds of financial support. So Congressman Jim McGovern and some other members of Congress just a few weeks ago introduced legislation to make sure that USDA is doing its part to support the farmers, the folks growing oats and pulses and lentils and other ingredients that go into plant-based foods, and to support the companies that the more than 55,000 people who work for food companies who are turning those ingredients into the foods we love. That's not just great for the farmers, it's not just great for the workers, it's also great for competitiveness. Some of you remember that we used to be the global leader on solar panel production, but we lost that because we didn't support our industry, and now we're importing solar panels. We certainly don't want to repeat that mistake when it comes to plant-based foods.
Is there any funding in the Farm Bill so far to try to motivate farmers to move from a CAFO sort of system to something more like grass-fed beef?
Yes. So there's a couple of things I'd point you to. One is within the Conservation Reserve Program. This is a really technical answer, sorry. The CRP program that I mentioned, there's a sub program called Grassland CRP. It's designed to support the production of livestock on grass, especially in places where those grasslands are under pressure from conversion. So that can be conversion into crops, it can be conversion into homes and businesses, but there's a part of CRP that's really designed to help support farmers who are raising animals on grass. And then there's another bill that was just introduced called the Cows Act. I don't remember what COW stands for. That's really designed to support farmers who are trying to change their animal waste management systems to reduce emissions that don't involve building what's called a digester or capping their lagoons. And some of you may be familiar with this. Some farmers will take all of their waste that's in a waste an animal waste storage facility. They'll cap it, they'll burn off the methane, and they'll generate electricity. And not everyone can afford to do that. There are certainly folks who are worried that subsidizing those digesters also helps incent farmers to get bigger enough so that they can afford to build and run a digester. So Congressman Jim Costa and Congressman Valadeo from California have come together to try to introduce legislation to create a new program to help farmers who aren't interested in necessarily in building a digester, to come up with better manure management systems to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we're not doing enough to help transition folks from confined systems to pasture-based systems. We could do a lot more. There are certainly ways that all of you could support that. You can make better choices in the supermarket. Again, you can sort of kind of trust those claims. Just a reminder that grass-fed, pasture-based, all those claims are there's no one going to the farm to see what's really happening. So fingers crossed. We're trying to fix that. And I think USDA is interested in fixing that too.
Yeah, that would be very helpful.
Yeah.
What do you think about the Agricultural Resilience Act, and are there any other specific marker bills that you would recommend that we pay attention to?
Yeah, so I'll just flag a few that I think are really important. One is a bill that Senator Booker and Senator Mike Lee introduced together. I know, talk about an odd couple, but they that would reduce the payments in the EQIP program. Remember, I mentioned that EQIP is paying for, among other things, animal waste storage lagoons that increase greenhouse gas emissions. The Booker-Lee bill would reduce the payments that go to animal waste storage lagoons, which is really important. We shouldn't be subsidizing practices that increase greenhouse gas emissions. I think everyone can agree with that. Congresswoman Hayes from Connecticut has, I think maybe today, introduced the House Companion. I hope I'm not getting ahead of Congresswoman Hayes, sorry. She's planning to introduce that bill on the House side. So that's one bill to look for, the EQIP Improvement Act. Another bill that Senator Booker and Senator Chuck Grassley from Iowa have introduced would reform the CRP program, the Conservation Reserve Program, to try to get those longer term deals that we talked about, so that farmers could enroll, take marginal lands, the hard to farm lands, the places that might get flooded all the time or really drought prone, and just plant them in grasses and trees for 20 or 30 years. And we would pay them more to do that. Because again, as all of you understand, because you're climate experts, getting that long-term carbon storage is really important to making sure that we're actually getting something, making a gain for the climate, and that we're not just temporarily building carbon only to see it get plowed up and released back into the atmosphere. And then Senator Carper and Senator Braun have introduced a bill that would, and I can send these around to folks afterwards if you're interested, that would just make reducing nitrous oxide and methane methane emissions a priority for the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, and just write it into the law that, that, as I said at the very beginning, if you tuned in late, one of the things we really need to do is, if a farmer shows up and says, hey, I want to be a climate steward, I want to adopt climate smart practices, I ought to get moved to the front of the line, right? So it's never going to be the case there's going to be enough money to meet all the demand from farmers. Isn't that wonderful? There's so much demand from farmers to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, so much so that there'll never be enough money to meet all that demand. So let's move the people to the front of the line who are offering to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Let's make the people who want to reduce nitrous oxide emissions by changing how they use fertilizer, or the folks who want to reduce methane emissions by changing what they feed animals or how they manage their animals or their waste. Let's move them to the front of the line. And that's what Senator Braun and Senator Carper are proposing to do in their bill. So all of those bills, plus Congressman McGovern's bill to scale up plant-based foods in the Farm Bill, the Agricultural Resilience Act, also a really important bill. I think what's exciting, and this is my sixth Farm Bill, not my last, I swear, sixth Farm Bill, is that there are so many members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, who are coming together to say, let's make climate a priority for the Farm Bill. That was simply not the case 5 years ago. So as depressing as all of this sometimes can be, or discouraging, because among other things, it means you probably shouldn't eat as much beef. Sorry. It's really exciting to see so many members of Congress have so many great ideas for how to address the climate crisis in the Farm Bill. People cared about the climate, never paid attention to the Farm Bill until this Farm Bill. So I think that's really an exciting development.
Yeah, it is, super exciting. And thank you so much, Scott, for this great presentation on this and for answering so many questions. I apologize we didn't get to everybody. There's so much more that people would like to know. And we need to go into this in more depth later. But for tonight, we have two actions. First, we're going to drop a link in the chat for an easy sign-on letter that you can send to members of Congress to ask them to include climate solutions in the reauthorization of the Farm Bill. So that's a letter to Congress. The Farm Bill must include climate solutions. And we also want people to take the Environmental Working Group's action calling on Congress to make climate a priority in the Farm Bill. Now, before I get to the second action, I'd like to remind you to mark your calendars for our next national call. It's going to be Power to the People Mobilizing for Climate Action with youth climate activist Helen Mancini and New York Times columnist and many other wonderful things, Phil McKibben. It's going to be Tuesday, September 26th at 7 p.m. And also watch for our special event bulletin coming later this week for important things happening throughout the month of September. There's going to be a lot going on. Very busy month for climate action. And last but not least, we're very excited to invite Matthew Ballreth from Climate Action Now to tell us about more ways that you can take action on the Climate Action Now app to help with the Farm Bill. We invite you to stay on with us for about an extra 5 minutes to take action using the CAN app. Let's see how many actions we can take together. So, Matthew, please tell us more.
Thank you so much, Francis. And yes, if you're psyched about the Farm Bill and ready to take action, we have some actions for you to take here on the Climate Action Now app. We have hundreds of actions for you to take, thanks to Marianne Krasny, who is an amazing ECA member and agricultural civic ecology, I think is the actual name of her domain, expert, who's created just a ton of actions on the Farm Bill. So I'm going to show you right now how you can download this app if you haven't already, and take a look at all these actions and all the things that you can do. I'm going to share my screen and put up we call our goal tracker here. As you can see, we've got a little pie chart of the Earth filling up. Folks have already taken over 15,000 actions on the Farm Bill, which is great. And to keep that number going up, all you have to do is scan this little code on the side. It's what's called a QR code. And if you're not familiar with it, it's really easy. All you have to do is take out your smartphone and hold it right up to your computer. Hold it right up to that little code on the screen, and open your camera app or whatever you use to take pictures on your phone. Point it right at that QR code and wait until a little yellow box pops up, and then just click right on that little yellow bubble underneath the box, and it should take you to the App Store or into the app if you already have it. Now I'll leave this up for a moment. Let everybody get a chance to scan this. If that's not working for you, just search for Climate Action Now in the App Store, however you get your apps. Search for Climate Action Now. Those are the 3 words. You're looking for an app with a black background and white letters, and you can download the app that way as well. But if you scan the code, it'll take you right to the actions for the Farm Bill. We have 112 of them, so not quite hundreds, but over 100 Farm Bill actions that you can take. I just saw a number go up on the goal tracker, so somebody got in and is taking actions. That's great. We also have many more actions on the CAN app. Over 17,000 actions on all varieties of environmental and climate action. Everything from methane and food waste to electrification, renewable energy, combating fossil fuels, all the major climate actions at this point we've basically collected into a big library that you can take right from this app. So I think I'll leave it at that, but I do want to say I know there's a lot of technology involved in this. So if anybody needs any help with this, if anybody wasn't able to download the app or anything like that, I'm going to put my email in the chat. Please do reach out, because once you've got the app and you're off to the races, it's basically an endless stream. It's a way to just stay involved and stay taking actions every single day. I want to make sure that anybody who wants to get on the app is able to do so. Great, and I'm seeing the numbers going up. It looks like a number of people have gotten to the app and gotten to the actions, which is great. So thanks a lot, everybody. I think I'll leave it at that. You can just leave this up a couple more minutes, but yeah, thanks for taking action.
That's everything we have for tonight, but please feel free to continue to take action tonight and in all the days to come. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming, especially thank you, Scott, for a great presentation.
Yeah, and if folks want to email me with questions, you can it's just sfaber@ewg.org. So feel free if we didn't get to your questions, or you wanted a link to something I mentioned, or whatever it is, gardening advice, just feel free to send me a note, sfaber@ewg.org. And thanks Francis and Jen and Leslie and Ariana for letting me join you.
And Scott, one quick question before you go. Could you send me a list of the bills that you mentioned tonight, and I can include those in the follow-up email that goes out tomorrow to everybody? And then we'll also make sure that we include all of the links that were shared with you tonight for different actions and the national call that's upcoming in the follow-up email that will go out tomorrow, along with the recording of this call. And we'll also make sure that you get Scott's email address in case you have further questions.
Wonderful. Thanks again for including me.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.